Hello and welcome to today's European SharePoint Office 365 and Azure Community webinar. My name is Shane and I'm delighted to be joined by Jasper Oosterveld, NVP in Spark Netherlands, who will be talking to you today about governance for Microsoft Teams, A to Z. Remember to join in the conversation about today's webinar on Twitter. Our Twitter handle is @EuropeanSP and our hashtag is ESPC21. Don't forget to check out the Resource Center. This is updated daily with the latest blogs, ebooks, webinars, and how-to videos. Simply visit SharePointEurope.com and click the content link at the top. After the webinar, we will have a questions and answers session. Type any questions you have in the questions window. Questions will be selected and answered at the end of the presentation. This webinar will be recorded and you will be notified by email when it is available. And now I'm going to pass you over to our webinar presenter, Jasper Oosterveld. Hello, Jasper.
Hi, good morning. Thank you for the introduction. Let me bring up my slide. Can you see my slide? Is it all good?
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you. So let me start the slideshow. Okay, well, hi everybody. Thanks for joining us online this morning. I saw a lot of people showed up, so that's always very nice. Yeah, a brief introduction about myself. I live and work in Amsterdam as a consultant, and my focus is around communication and collaboration with Microsoft Teams. And of course, pretty wide, of course, pretty broad, sorry. But my focus within that area is compliance, governance, and adoption. And of course, governance, that's what we're here for today. I work for a company called InSpark, and I'm also a Microsoft MVP for the last 7 years. Yeah, so that's a little bit about me, but I think what's more important is about how to set up a successful governance strategy for Microsoft Teams. So how do you do that? Well, we basically do this in with a 3-step model. Sounds complex, but it is definitely not. So we first start with a workshop, then we define the governance strategy, and then last but not least, we also have to implement this governance strategy. Well, but before I do that, and I will talk to you now, I'll also talk with my customers, maybe a little bit more informal now, probably. But so what I do before I dive into the whole governance aspect, I first want to give them a brief introduction of what Microsoft Teams is and what it can do. And of course, it depends on the customer. There are, of course, customers who have a lot more experience, and then you don't have to go over all the basics. You can just more summarize it. But what I do, I say Microsoft Teams is the hub for collaboration and communication, and it consists out of a couple of pillars. The first one is chat, and the nice thing about chat is that it's really an informal way of communicating with each other. And back home, in the Netherlands, we're pretty informal anyway. So for us, that's not really like one of the focus points. But there's still a lot of companies out there who are trying to kind of move away from a more formal structured communication style to more informal, and chat is perfect for that. It's quick, it's easy, it's fun. You know, you have the gifs, the emojis, the memes. It's just so different than email. And apart from that, by using chat, you will also reduce the amount of emails that you will receive or have to send. Now, that's always nice, of course. The second one is meetings, and that is basically having more efficient meetings. So, you know, sharing your screen, writing down, using, for example, the whiteboard application, sharing your OneNote, recording meetings, and it's so much more efficient than you know, how we used to do it. One of the points I also always address is that, you know, it's nice you don't have to travel everywhere. It's kind of, you know, it's not really applicable now during, of course, the pandemic. But again, let's say that all goes away eventually. You don't have to go to every meeting. You can just use Microsoft Teams to participate. The third one is calling, and with calling, I'm referring to setting up like a data center or like the whole PBX functionality. That's not my area of expertise. So when I do these workshops, that's not something I discuss, but it is a part of Microsoft Teams. So yeah, you have to address that. The fourth one, of course, is collaboration, and I think that's one of the key points of Microsoft Teams, and that's collaborating with a group of people. So that can be your colleagues, but it can also be people outside of your company. So for example, partners, suppliers, etc. And the last one is apps and workflows. And then the nice thing about Microsoft Teams is that it provides an integrated experience, and it integrates with other Microsoft services, for example, Power Automate or Power Apps, allowing you to basically digitalize business processes and integrate those within Teams. So what we did last year is we set up a system that checks if you're at the office. Oh, well, I haven't used it much last year, but we did in the beginning of the year. But it checks if you're at the office, and then it asks you if you participated in the company lunch. Because if that's the case, you have to some money has to be withdrawn from your salary, mainly due to tax reasons. So the app asks you that question, you confirm or you deny, and when you confirm, a signal is being sent to an external system. It's a financial system, it's not from Microsoft, and it automatically withdraws, it counts it up by the end of the month, and then it withdraws it from my salary. So before that, one of our colleagues had to do that manually. It's not the nicest thing to do, of course. There's more important tasks to do. Now it's all digitalized, integrated away in Teams, so that it saves up a lot of time and money as well. Simple example, but there's so many more you probably can come up with. Then normally I do a demo, and then I just demo how you chat, how you work with files, how you use channels, just basically the basics. And I think I spent around 15 to 20 minutes, kind of depending, of course, of the level of expertise and the level of knowledge from the customer around Teams. I'm not going to do that now because I want to focus more on the governance side of things. But when you do a presentation like this, or when you try to implement a governance strategy with your customers or internally, I definitely recommend doing that. But because if I can talk about it, but seeing it always works a lot better. So this is basically the summary. So what I tell my customers, and talked about the pillars of Teams, and you've seen a demo, and then hopefully what you've seen is that Teams offers a central and integrated work experience. And still, in my eyes, one of the most powerful aspects of Teams, because I don't have to switch that much anymore to do certain tasks. If I want to work with Yammer, I can do that through Teams. I have my department team where I can go to work with files. I don't have to switch to a browser to see my OneDrive. I can do that within Teams. Ideally, you can also integrate other systems. So more and more you can do it in Teams. And it definitely helps. And it definitely helps increasing your productivity as well. I know it's a little bit of a marketing term, and I always find it difficult to kind of pinpoint a percentage. But because you work within Teams and you can do a lot of your tasks there, you don't have to switch between other applications. So you can concentrate and focus a lot more. And that definitely has a positive impact on your productivity. There's still a lot of customers who are or were in the process of going through a digital transformation. So basically moving a lot of using the clouds, moving services to the cloud, basically to take advantage of the cloud, more updates, more features, so they can innovate a lot more. Well, the advantage of Teams is, of course, that it is a cloud-only application. So you're basically already doing that. So by using Teams, you're already accelerating the digital transformation of your company. And the last one I find very important as well, and that's because I do a lot with compliance as well these days, is that on one side, your data is secure in the data centers of Microsoft. They make sure nobody, only the correct people can access it. They do all the backups and everything. That's all set up. But you do have a responsibility as an organization to make sure that once data is on your devices, and it doesn't really matter if it's a desktop or a laptop or a mobile phone or a tablet, then it's your responsibility to make sure that data is secure and that data is compliant. You cannot go back to Microsoft and tell them like, hey, one of our laptops has been stolen and it contains sensitive data. And they're like, well, that's, sorry to hear that, but that's not our responsibility. They do provide services for that, right? And we'll talk about a couple of those during this presentation as well. But I just want to emphasize that it's something you are responsible for. So if you're not doing that yet, please start as soon as possible. So then I move on and I ask them like, now you've seen Teams, you heard me talk about it. What are some of the worries you have implementing this within your organization? And what I really like is that after doing this for like 2 years, is that basically here is the same ones, and it's the ones I will discuss with you as well. The first one, of course, is a Teams explosion. By opening up Teams for the whole organization and letting everybody create a team, especially IT, but also the business is worried that there are going to be so many teams in a short amount of time. And the second one is duplication, because let's say everybody's allowed to create a team. Yeah, there's a huge risk of teams with the same purpose or the same name, because maybe you're aware of that, but if you go to Teams and you create a team called marketing, and one of your colleagues does the same, Teams doesn't tell you, hey, there is already a team called marketing, maybe you should use that one. Unfortunately, it doesn't do that. So that's a risk that you can have a lot of duplicate teams. Especially if the name of a team is very unclear, it can be very hard to know also for IT, but also for the business, like what is this team actually used for, right? What is the purpose of a team? These days, it's still not that easy to find teams. If you go to the Teams application and you try to find a team, first of all, it only shows the it shows the public teams. Yeah, that I get that, because you don't always want to expose private teams, but there used to be a feature where at least the owner was able to say, hey, I know my team is private, but I don't mind if people find it. Unfortunately, that feature has been gone for a while now. I hope it comes back one time, but it does make it difficult to find a team. So then the risk increases on a duplication, right? And also, if you want to find a public team, that whole interface is not really good search-wise. So it's not easy always to find a team. The complexity, that's more aimed at the creation process through the out-of-the-box Microsoft Teams application. And maybe if you have a real IT background, maybe you're like, well, I don't really understand why it's complex. But try to look at it from a business user point of view. There's a lot of options these days, right? And it talks about groups, about reusing templates. So especially for the less tech-savvy business users, it's not definitely that easy to use. That's something to keep in mind as well. And the last one, of course, is talked about it a little bit, is a data leak, right? Especially now, so many companies are now using Teams, also because of the pandemic. We have to work more from home. Yeah, a lot more data is now being stored within Teams, so that also increases the risk of a data leak. And that's something we'll touch upon today as well during the presentation, what you can do to prevent that. Well, again, I don't think this is really a surprise. What will happen is if you don't address these worries and if you don't implement a governance strategy, two things will happen. On one hand, you'll have a failed user adoption because people will get frustrated, right? They can find anything and they don't really understand how everything works, and they eventually will stop using it. And that's a huge shame, because I think we all know how powerful Teams is and how powerful it can be for your company as well. And on the other side, of course, we have IT, especially, there can be so many teams and it will be so hard to manage for IT. And then, because when something happens, people will go to IT and will blame them. It's like, hey, where's my team? Or why are there so many teams? And, and that will just increases their workload as well. So that's why I want to kind of emphasize what's so important about setting up a governance strategy. And when you do that, it's very important that you connect IT and the business, because both of these audiences, so to speak, they need to be aware of each other, what each other's requirements are, and what are the requirements of the business, right? What are the requirements of IT, and also what are the responsibilities? Because the business is not always aware of what the responsibilities for IT are, and vice versa. So if you bring these together, they will talk to each other, there'll be more understanding, and there will be definitely a reduction of you're basically reducing communication frustration or errors down the line. Well, the next one is, of course, adoption, right? Because you want your business users, your colleagues, your customers, you want them to use Teams, and you want them to use it properly, the way you intended it to, they work with it. So that's where you use adoption for. Basically, yeah, you want to help people changing the way they work. You want them to adopt that new technology. But you have to realize that in your governance strategy, you're making certain decisions that impact the way you do you execute your adoption strategy. For example, let's say in your governance strategy, you say, hey, it's fine that people invite external people. That's fine. But the responsibility will lie with the owners of a team. So that's something you have to communicate and have to educate people with through your adoption strategy. So these two go hand in hand. So not only not just do adoption, governance, and vice versa. You really have to do it both. The third one is integration of procedures, law, and regulation. So by that I mean if you use Teams just out of the box, Teams doesn't know what your internal procedures are, right? Maybe one of your internal procedures is if you want to use a non-Microsoft app, you have to go through a request process. But if Teams doesn't know that, Teams just enables it by default. So that can cause some issues as well. On the other side, where I live in Amsterdam, in the Netherlands, so we are part of the European Union. So we have to comply to GDPR, for example. So, but again, by default, Teams doesn't know what that entails. There are tools to help you with that, but by default, it won't do that. Or let's say you have certain regulations where you're not allowed to share a banking number, an IBAN number, or a social security number. Again, if you don't do anything, I can just put it in a chat or put it in a Word document and nothing will happen. So you need to look at your internal procedures and the law and regulations and then match that to the usage of Teams. And the last one is a little bit more technical, but the foundation of Teams lies with Microsoft 365 groups. And a couple things happen. Is first of all, if you create a team, two things will happen. The first thing that will happen is that within Azure Active Directory, and that's of course the source where all the users are being stored and security groups are being stored, it will create something called a Microsoft 365 group and in Azure Active Directory. And that's basically a group that contains people, users, right? And those are divided between owners and members. But let's say you don't do anything around governance or adoption, and a lot of teams are being created. Maybe your Azure AD administrator is like, hey, where are all these like 10, 20, 50, 60 groups coming from, right? So they can create a lot of confusion. And on the other side, if you use Teams, you're basically going to use a lot more services within the Microsoft 365 suite, right? You can use Forms, you have SharePoint, you can use Power BI, Planner, etc., etc. So this has a huge impact on one side, the administrators of maybe those services, but also your business users who need to learn how to work with that. So now, and most customers done at this point have an understanding why governance is so important for rollout of Microsoft Teams, but also long-term successful usage. So what we do, we start with a workshop. And what I just discussed now, of course, is part of the workshop, but then we dive into the topics that need to be defined for the governance strategy. So we start with the scope, and I can't dive into all these topics because then we need a couple more hours. But the first thing you need to do is define your scope. So what is the scope of your governance strategy? For example, collaboration with a group of people in projects. I'm just giving an example. But then at least you know this is the scope of our governance strategy related to teams. The next one is vision and goals. So this is basically, you should be able to use this from your adoption strategy, because in your adoption strategy you describe, hey, what is our vision from our company? What are we trying to achieve? Right? And how does Teams fit in with that? Because you use that within your messaging towards the whole company, right? But it's also good to include that in your governance strategy document. The third one is a steering committee. You can also call the governance board. I just like the word steering committee. That's something we use more within the Netherlands, so that that connects more to my customers. You can also use the governance board. The name doesn't really matter. It's more matters is what the people do who are part of the committee. Because you have to realize, once you define your strategy, you agreed upon it, you implemented it, the world changes, right? There maybe you did this a year ago and then this pandemic happens. It's like, well, how does that impact the usage and the rollout and the implementation of Teams within our organization? And also Microsoft changes, right? They introduce a lot of new features that also impact your organization. So you need to have a group of people who come together on a periodic basis that discuss internal developments and external developments, and how does that impact the governance strategy? Because maybe they need to make some changes to it. Roles and responsibilities, that's on one side is defining who are the administrators. So who are the administrators of Teams, of Office 365, of SharePoint? So that's clear for everybody. So when when something is addressed that's related to a certain role, you know who to go to, oh, sorry, you know who to go to. And on the other hand, it's also the roles and responsibilities of certain departments. What are the responsibilities of the marketing department or of the compliance department, all related to teams. This is the one we'll dive into more for today, so I'll leave that for now. You also need to look at your internal procedures and processes. So for example, let's say somebody joins the company. How can we make sure that person gets a license? How we can make sure that person is added to the correct team? What happens if somebody moves to a different function or a different department? What happens when somebody leaves the company? And the last one is new features and updates. I think we're all aware how quick the developments go, especially around teams, especially since the pandemic hit last year. And that's fantastic, but you also need to be able to anticipate changes. And how do you process those changes? So what you have to do is take a look at the roadmap. Keep an eye on the Office 365 Admin Center. Follow these events, for example. So you're aware of what's coming, and then you also need to define, okay, how do we anticipate those changes? This is the core of today's session. So when we define the team's workload, these are basically the topics we look at. And I have multiple slides for each topic, so I won't go down the list now. So the first one is templates. Now, if you go to Teams, you create a team, right? But you probably want to use Team for different collaboration purposes. So first thing you have to do is define the templates you want to use. So these 4 are the most common ones I see. So customers want to work around departments. They want to work in projects. Maybe there's some cross-department collaboration. And let's say you want to collaborate around customers. So these are, for example, the 4 templates you define. So you start with that. That's your starting point. I would advise to keep it simple and small. So I think 4 should be the max in the beginning, because if you do 10, that's a lot. I'm just exaggerating, but that could be a lot. It's already a big impact for your organization. So I would advise to start with 4. So once you define your templates, the next thing you need to do is take a look at a couple other topics. So the first one is the naming policy. Do you want to apply a naming policy of naming convention per template? So for example, this is one we often see. So we often see that customers define a project as a template, and each time a project is created, it says PROJ dash and then the name of the team. And then often the customers also want to address the SharePoint URL. And that's something you can only do by provisioning. So if you want to change the SharePoint URL like you see here, you have to use a provisioning solution. So this is an example. So how can you do this? There are a couple options. The first one is using the Azure AD naming policy. So what you can do here, it sounds very complex when you read it, but what you can do, you can basically say each time somebody creates a team, I want to add a prefix and or suffix with a custom word and AAD property. So for example, what you see here, the first one is a word. So each time a team is created, it has the word collaboration, then the name of, it says group, but the name of the team, and then it adds the department, for example, after that. This has been around for a long time. To be fair, I still haven't seen it being implemented with one of my customers. And I'll talk a little bit more why that is. You can also buy a provisioning solution, create your own, and then you connect a naming policy to that. For example, that example I showed in the previous slide, that's something you can enforce by using a provisioning solution. If you go more for a self-service scenario, and it's something we'll talk about in the end, so basically you allow your employees to create teams through the Teams application, you can maybe tell them like, hey, when you create a team, use this naming convention, naming policy. You don't have to do it. It's not mandatory, but it's something you have to discuss internally. And now I have a good example for a customer where they had to use it, right? But I don't always see it. So again, one of the advantages is it definitely improves the findability of a team. It also makes the purpose a lot more clear. If you want to use that AAD naming policy, you need to have an up-to-date AAD, especially if you want to use those properties like department or maybe region. Yeah, your AAD needs to be up to date. The problem is if you define multiple collaboration templates, try to find one word that matches those templates. And for example, collaboration. yeah, it sounds okay, but you still don't know, is this a department or is this a project, right? So that makes it almost impossible as well. Employees will forget. If you tell them, please, can you do it? And they won't do it just to annoy you, but they just forget. Like, they're, oh, I need a team. So creating a team, and they're just going to forget about it. So that's why my advice is only apply when it's really necessary, when there's really a business requirement to do so. So for example, we had a local district, and they shared their Office 365 tenant with a couple other local districts and external companies. So for them, it was, yeah, they had to use a naming policy so they could see when a team was created, which organization, which district did it belong to, or which organization it belonged to, because then immediately could see like, hey, this is district A, this is B, this is company A, this is company B. So that helped for the business users and also for IT. So that was a good business case. Sorry. So the next thing you have to do, you have to decide what is the external access per template. Do I want to allow it for all of them? Maybe for a selection, or I want to disable it for all of them, or do I want to let people decide by using a sensitivity label? And I'll talk a little bit more about that later. So by allowing external access, you'll definitely reduce shadow IT, because people will, because if you don't, let's say you block it, people will find a different way. They will maybe create a Box account. I've seen that a lot out there, or Dropbox. People will store a lot of files there, share with external people. I think we all know why that's not a good idea, because you basically lose sight at where your company data is stored and where it's going. And the next one, it's just more efficient, right? You want people to be able to collaborate in one central location, internally and externally. So what are some challenges? The first one is, once you allow external people within a team, they basically have access to the files that are stored there, right? So what in theory they can do, they can basically download the files, and then they maybe share them with people who are not allowed to see those files. So you increase the risk on a data leak. So that's why compliance is crucial. So that's why you really have to look at data classification and DLP, right? So at least when somebody has access to a team, you can still secure certain data. So that means that, okay, let's have a presentation that's only allowed for me to be seen. I apply a label. The external person could download it, but because that label has a configuration where it says, no, this is only for InSpark people, he or she, the external person, they have the presentation, but they can't do anything with it. Owners are the only one basically allowed to invite external people, so it does increase their responsibility. And it's fine, this works, but it's something you have to address within your adoption strategy. So I advise to turn it on for all teams. Again, that I say my advice doesn't mean this has to be done, because there are definitely certain situations where this doesn't work. But there are, if you go this route and you say, okay, I want to turn it on by default for all, I strongly advise to have some review processes in check, or some controls in check. So what you can do, you can use Azure Access Reviews, where you create a review policy where the owners of a team have to periodically review the members of us, periodically review the guests, or you can create your own solution. There are some graph connectors that allow you to kind of create a sort of periodic review yourself as well. Social control also works, because people will notice if there are external people within their team. They will just see it behind the name of the external person. You have to educate your team owners. You can, for example, tell like, hey, you are the owner of a department team. External access is on, but for these type of teams, we don't want you to do that. So, you can, again, it's no guarantee they won't do it, but at least you educated them. And again, you have to start with your compliance, data classification, and DLP. And next up is an expiration policy. Do you want to apply an expiration policy for the templates? What is an expiration policy? Well, with an expiration policy, you basically set an X amount of days, for example, 6 months, whereby the policy is checking before those 6 months, is this team actively being used? And I will discuss in a second what that means. So let's say it's not being used actively. 30 days before, an email will be sent, and within Teams you will see a renew option asking the owners, do you want to renew this team? If they say, if they don't respond, it will be again 15 days later, then 1 day before. And then if they don't respond at all, it will be automatically moved to the recycle bin. It will stay in its recycle bin for 30 days. And after those 30 days, it's gone forever. So that's basically what the policy does. These days, what's nice is you have an activity check. Because beforehand, and this has been around for a while, but beforehand, it also sent an email or a notification towards teams that are being used actively. That's kind of annoying because it's like, why am I getting this question? This is a team I work on a daily basis. So these days you have an activity check where the system will see, hey, are team members working with files or are they opening channels? Yes, okay, then again, I'm not sending a notification. I will just renew the team for another 6 months or year, whatever date you enter there. So that's definitely really helpful. So what are some advantages and challenges? Well, you definitely keep your tenant clean. Because personally, I like to have a clean tenant as well, because like, why would you have a lot of teams there that are basically not being used anymore? It will reduce the manual maintenance for IT, because the responsibility and the action is moved towards the owners, so IT doesn't have to do that. Of course, this comes with certain challenges. And what I mentioned before, if that team is deleted and it's after those 30 days, it's gone forever, that means your data is gone. And that can be a bad thing, of course. So that's why, again, there's a huge responsibility with owners, and they need to be aware of their actions. And the last one is you really need to have some retention policies clear. We'll talk a little bit more about retention later, but basically with retention, you can prevent certain data being deleted. So even if the team is being deleted, the data is still protected by retention policy. So I advise to start by turning this on for a year and then evaluate after 3 months, 6 months to see how it's going, because you can always change that date. That date will look at the creation date. So that's what it bases this a year at, or 6 months, or whatever you put it on. You really have to look at your retention policies. So look internally, what are we obliged, what kind of data is mandatory to be removed after a certain time, or do we need to keep for a certain time? You need to look at that, so at least you're preventing that data is not deleted by accident because of the expiration policy. Then you need to look at the privacy settings of your teams, of your template, sorry. So is this template always private? So that means that the owners are the only people able to invite other colleagues or external people to become a member. Is it public? So basically allowing everybody to become a member, or they want to use an org-wide team where automatically the whole organization is being added. I still haven't seen that one being applied. There's also a max of 5, so that's also not ideal. The most ones I see these days are actually private, and it's also mainly due to law and regulation. I'm still a huge fan of open by default because it definitely improves knowledge sharing, easily reusing content. But of course, that's not always possible, right? We also have a management team. We also have a board of directors. Yeah, of course, their team cannot be open. So of course, there are also always exceptions, but try to be as much as open by default. But again, also look at some law and regulations if that's actually allowed. You have to be aware that owners are always able to change the privacy setting, for example, from public to private, from private to public, but not when a sensitivity label is being used. And I think I'll address it after this, because with that label, label enforces a privacy setting. So let's say the enforcement is public. Yeah, you cannot change it to private anymore. That's just not possible. Okay, first backup and restore. Yeah, so you need to be aware if a team is deleted, it's stored for 30 days in the recycle bin. And that's everything. So not just the chat, but everything that's related to the team. So SharePoint, Planner, Stream, etc. There's a recycle bin for channels in Teams. They stay there for 30 days. Content is being stored in the SharePoint recycle bin. So what can happen is you delete a team, but the SharePoint side of things, so the team is deleted after 30 days, but then you still have 63 days for the SharePoint side of things. Videos are currently stored in Stream, but the recordings will be stored in OneDrive and SharePoint this year. The Stream has a recycle bin for 30 days. And let's say those recordings are moved to SharePoint, then you'll have those 93 days. So what you have to do, you have to review these default options that Microsoft basically gives you and match these internally. does this work for us, or do we have certain regulations or internal agreements that basically forces us to look at additional software? Because there are a lot of vendors out there, and I added 8 point here. I'm not saying you have to use them. I've seen that one in action, and there are multiple other vendors are there as well. So if you have to go down this route, I would advise to look at a couple options, but there are definitely multiple vendors who offer a backup solution. And again, you have to look at those retention policies, so you can prevent that no data or chat is accidentally deleted that should not have been deleted. So now I'm moving to sensitivity labels. Traditionally, labels have been used. The sensitivity labels used to be called Azure Information Protection labels. They're now called sensitivity labels. Traditionally, they were being used to label content. So, for example, I can label this presentation as public, meaning that this presentation is accessible for the whole world. Let's say this is a presentation for the management team. I can add a label, for example, being called internal confidential, meaning this presentation is now only accessible for InSpark members, colleagues, employees. So now you have an option to extend these labels. So you can extend them to be used in Teams. So let's say you have a label called internal. You can now say for the label, when this label is being used with a team, the privacy setting is public or private. Guest access is allowed or blocked. The external sharing options are set for anyone, new and existing guests or none. This is still in preview, but you can use it, but still in preview. And the last one is, how do you manage unmanaged devices? So, for example, let's say I'm a guest with an unmanaged device. By using this setting, I can say, okay, that's fine, but they can only use the web, or they can use the whole Office suite, or they're blocked. And if you use this option, you really have to talk to the person internally responsible for Intune, because this can kind of mess up their policies. The label that you attach to a team does nothing with the content. So if I connect a label internal to my team, the documents, they don't get automatically that label internal. That's not available. Maybe in the future you'll be given that option, but for now that's not there. So what does it look like? So first of all, you have the label. This is the label settings. So this is just the settings option. So here I say this label I want to use for groups and sites. Then I can make a decision. Do I want to have protection settings and also for groups, but also for sites? So here you see a protection setting for groups. So here's the privacy option, an external user access option. So what does this look like? So let's say I use this label project. You can see in the screenshot, I can only select the privacy option private. The other one is just not available. When I want to add an external user, yeah, you will just get this message. This is not my favorite error message because it's kind of unclear. Ideally, you want the message to say, because of internal policies, blah, 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 you cannot add guests. But again, it doesn't work. Block it, but the error message could be a bit better. And this is just an example what it would look like if you have an unmanaged device and you said, okay, you're not allowed to access the data. So I advise if you want to use this and you also want to go more for self-service creations where people using the Microsoft Teams application, this is an ideal combination because then you teach people to select a certain label and then certain settings are immediately applied, like guest access, the privacy, and the sharing settings. But I strongly advise to start with a data classification project where you define, okay, what kind of information policies do we have? What kind of labels do we need to attach? What are some of the rules of the labels? But do that in a separate project because that already has a huge impact on your organization as well. If you combine it with this, it'll become the workload will become too big. So then moving on to DLP, data loss prevention. So with data loss prevention, you can prevent the sharing of sensitive information in chat. And sensitive information, that's a broad that's a broad definition. But for example, that can be a social security number, a credit card number, an IBAN number. But you can also define your own sensitive information. So let's say you work at Sony and you're working on the PlayStation 6. you can create a sensitive information type called PlayStation 6. And when that word is being used, you can enable a DLP policy that prevents you of posting a chat with that word. And this applies also to documents. So I can apply the same policy, for example, in Word documents, where if I use the word PlayStation 6, this policy is triggered. And for example, it prevents me to share that document with external people. If you want to use DLP with chat, you need an E5 license. This is not the case for SharePoint, for documents. That just works with E3. So this is what it looks like. So I create a document. I added some text with an IBAN number. Very quickly, within a couple seconds, the policy tip pops up. And when I click on the policy tip, it gives me more explanation why that's happening. You can also see it in SharePoint. So you see the little icon. I see the policy tip. I click on it, and then it gives me a message. And this message you see where it says this message or item is blocked, you can define it yourself. That's just what I added there for this example. Then it says, okay, what information type, sensitive information is included. So in this case, it's an IBAN number. And then I can give the option to my employees. Do I want to allow them to report it? So basically, they can let them know from like, hey, I'm getting this policy, but it doesn't make any sense because this is not sensitive information. That can happen in theory. Or you can also allow them to override it. Both of these actions are logged into a DLP log, basically, where you can, for example, give a CISO access, and he or she can see all the triggers of all the DLP policies. What does it look like in Teams? Very similar. Again, some gibberish with an IBAN number in it. Immediately, a policy tip pops up. I get a message in the right bottom where it says, hey, your message is blocked. And I see the same policy tip as I saw in SharePoint. So what do I advise? Again, look at your internal procedures and also some regulations you have to comply to and match that with how you are going to use Teams. Do a lot of testing. Although DLP sounds very straightforward, it doesn't always guarantee 100% trigger rate. So you definitely do a lot of testing. So look at the different kind of documents you are going to use and make sure that policy is triggered when it should be triggered, of course. Now you have to educate your employees because, as you see, a lot can happen, right? A lot of pop-ups, a lot of messages. So if you just turn this on, your IT will get so many calls. So this is something you want to prevent. And again, just like data classification, set this up in a separate project because, again, it takes time to define it, to test it. And if you combine this all with setting up your governance strategy, this will take a long, long, long time. Retention is basically aimed at retaining content and chat for an X amount of period. And the X amount of period can be days, months, or years. And can also be retaining and then deleting content or chat after 6 months, for example. Or you just want to delete certain content or chat after, for example, 6 months. And what that is, what is this content or chat you delete or you want to preserve? That's something you define based on retention policies. So, for example, you can say when we have resumes, these have to be automatically deleted after 3 months. I don't know if it's shorter or longer. I'm just giving you an example. That's what you can do with retention. Retention for chat in private channels is still not supported. It's been like that for a while. So definitely check it out if that's still accurate. I think I checked it out a couple of weeks ago. It was still so, but things can change. So check that out. But retention for content in private channels, that works. This one is the same as DLP. You make sure what are your regulations, what are some procedures, test it out, educate your employees, and also set it up in a separate project. Now we finally reach the creation process because once you defined all these, you defined your templates and then you defined basically the policies per template. Now you can basically take a look at, okay, how are we going to allow our employees to create these templates? So what you can do, of course, is do a self-service for the Teams application. You can, for everybody, you can also say, no, I want only a select amount of people to use the Teams application. or you want to do it more controlled and maybe an approval process with a provisioning solution for a selection of employees or all employees. So how do you determine if you use the Microsoft Teams application by the create team option or use provisioning solution? This basically depends on the requirements. So this could be collaboration formats, and maybe you want to use 5 collaboration formats. Well, these days you can use Teams templates, so that could work. So let's say you have 5 collaboration formats. The only thing you want is that it has that you can see it's a project department, but that's it. You know, you don't need a naming policy, etc. You can use those Teams templates. But let's say all those collaboration formats, templates, have unique naming policies. Yeah, then you're often pushed more towards a provisioning solution. It's the same with strict external access policies. Maybe you can address it with the sensitivity labels, but if that doesn't work, yeah, then you're more pushed towards a provisioning solution. It's the same with expiration policies. There's not really a wrong or right? It doesn't, I'm not saying provisioning is bad or self-service creation is bad. Self-service scenario is bad. It just really depends on your requirements, but it also depends on the kind of company you have, because there are a lot of companies that they don't feel comfortable giving their employees this kind of power, so to speak, to create teams. So look at your requirements and look at what kind of company you are, and then make that decision. That said, I see at least 95% of our customers using provisioning. Totally fine. Because what I think is that after, let's say you do that now, within a year, 2 years, there's the organization more mature. Microsoft provides more out of the box options, so you don't have to use provisioning anymore. Then what you also have to do, and we're almost there, no worries, you have to define your Teams settings. So these are basically settings within the Teams administration center that you also have to go through, and then have to decide, okay, are we going to use the default or are we going to change the default? So this can be, for example, working with private channels. Are you allowing that, yes or no? And these policies you see here, you can apply them to the whole company, but you can also these days apply them to a selection of people. So for example, you can say people who are part of this department, they are allowed to create private channels, but other people aren't. You have to look at your message policies. Do you want to use the giveaways? Are people allowed to delete their own posts? Do you have to read receipts? You just have to go through that and then make a decision. Apps, do you allow all apps or just the Microsoft ones? Some settings. Do you want to use the tagging feature? If you do, who do you want to allow to create tags? Maybe just the owners, maybe also the members. Do you want to use third-party file storage, where you, for example, can integrate Box, Dropbox within your file step in Teams? And to be fair, I never really see that, but you can. Once you've done this, so you had the workshop, and we basically split it in two. So I do a workshop where I go over the, what's Microsoft Teams, why is governance important, all these topics I basically just discussed. Then we meet up with the customer again in a couple weeks later, because people need time to gather information, make some decisions. But then we get an agreement on all those topics. I still add these in a document. I know it's very old-fashioned. You can probably do this in a nicer way, maybe in a PowerPoint presentation, or maybe in a SharePoint page, whatever, so long you write it down somewhere. Then what I do, I present these findings. So I go over the decisions that have been made. And then I also give them some advice. I didn't add it here, but I give them advice saying like, hey, based on your requirements, your decisions, I advise to use a provisioning solution, for example. Now, once you've done that, you need to finalize your strategy. Everybody agrees, okay, this is what we're going for. And then you basically have to implement it, right? And that means you have to configure some Microsoft Teams settings, right? Maybe you decide, I don't want people to use the marketplace for apps. So I just want to provide them with the Microsoft apps. That's a setting you have to change. And then huge change, you have to implement a governance solution. We have our own, but you can use AvePoint, for example. There are many others. ShareGate has a great solution that's more aimed for the self-service scenario, but still fantastic tool. Just look at that, look at what your requirements are, and then look at kind of solution you need. So I think, yeah, 10 to 12, not bad. So again, I hope you enjoyed the session. We'll go, if there are any questions, we'll go over that in a second. These are my contact details, so you can reach out to me if you want. So you can send me an email or Twitter, or LinkedIn, whatever you prefer, and that's also my blog at the end. I added some resources that I think are helpful, a couple of them. So yeah, that's basically my session for today. So I don't know if there are any questions. So I don't know, Shane, do you know?
Thanks for a great presentation, Jasper. Yeah, now we will start the questions and answers part. And should you wish to ask a question, please type it into the questions window now. Okay, some questions are in, so I'll start working through them, Jasper. First one, what methods of cloud governance do you recommend? Would you look at third-party tools, or would you propose a more manual check and balance of the estate?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think it really depends on your requirements. And then once you have the requirements, what I always do is first look at what Microsoft provides out of the box. And then if you can use that, I would always go for that. But there are always cases where that doesn't, where Microsoft is just not there yet, or that they're still working on stuff. Then I would look into, like, for example, external solutions to do your cloud governance. 8 point, what I said, 8 point has one. The only thing you have to remember, it costs. There's always a license fee attached to it. So yeah, you have to basically make a decision like, okay, these are requirements. This is what Microsoft offers. It may be what Microsoft have works for us, but maybe that what 8 point has or another one works more, but there's also costs attached to it. So you have to make a decision like, are those costs, do they weigh up? You know what I mean? Like, I have these requirements, but are these additional costs necessary to comply with it, or can I use Microsoft? But that's basically what you have to do. Look at your requirements and then match that to what Microsoft offers. And then if that's not sufficient, look at third party and then see what they offer and what additional costs are. And then you have to make a decision. Sounds easier than done, but that's basically the way to go.
And if you were to recommend a third-party solution, who would be your preferred tool would you recommend to customers?
This like I mentioned a couple, but so what I mentioned before, for example, is ShareGate Apricot. That tool is really aimed at customers who go more for a self-service scenario, and then it offers a lot of features where you can manage your teams, manage external access. That's a great tool for that part. And the other one I've seen is the one from 8 point, and they really aimed at the whole process. So the provisioning, so requesting teams, making sure there's approval, and then creating a team and applying governance. The only downside of those tools are they cost additional money, and that, again, I cannot make the decision for you if that's an issue or it's not an issue. And we basically created our own provisioning solution by using the P&P materials and some additional custom development. So that's what we use. But again, I mentioned now ShareGate and 8 point, but there's so many more. I would just take a look at maybe 2 or 3 and then request a demo. And then, and then look at what it does and then match it to your requirements and look at the costs. Those are the 2 I've seen, but that doesn't mean that they're perfect. There are many more out there. So try to take a look at a couple.
Okay, where and how do I create Teams templates?
Yeah, in the Teams Administration Center, there should now be an option. I think it's the first one. I think if you go to the Admin Center, the first one is, top of my head, policies. It should be there. If it's not there, you should Google for Microsoft Teams templates, and I think one of the top results will guide you to a Microsoft page. I think it's docs.com these days, where maybe you'll have to do like a PowerShell script, but I believe it should be available for almost all customers now.
Okay, what are the out-of-the-box settings for these controls?
For what controls?
Yeah, I'm not 100% sure. Maybe that person can come back and be a bit more specific. Will the sessions be available to download? Yes, this session will be available in the Resource Center, and an email will be sent later when it's available for viewing. Can you recommend some monitoring tools, e.g. Syskit Point or Trance?
No, I have no experience with The only one I've used for monitoring wise is ShareGate Apricot. That's the only one I've used monitoring wise. I haven't tried any of the other external solutions, no.
Okay. Is there any chance to prevent Teams owners to rename his or her team?
That's a good one. No, there's not. Yeah, I've had that request from other customers. Currently, that's not possible now.
Okay. Microsoft has published a Word document called Upgrade Planning Workshop. Are you familiar with this guide to S4B to Teams upgrade? Would you recommend it to use it in the journey, or do you have a better guide? Thanks.
Yeah, I don't have any experience with upgrading from Skype for Business to Teams. No, sorry.
Okay. Where can you find usage statistics?
Yeah, and that's a real, yeah, that Microsoft has still a lot of work to do because it's so spread out. But you have a couple of locations. If you are an owner of a team, if you go to the team settings, there's a tab called, I think it's called analytics or something like that. That's where you can see the usage of your team. That's where you can take a look. Um, the the administrators with access to the Teams administration center, they also have like a usage option. That's where they can go to. So that's more for IT. And then for the owners of Teams, can do it in their team itself. And then you still, I believe, in the Office 365 admin center, you also have usage. But I believe the one you see there is the same as in the Teams admin center. I'm not 100% sure. But those are basically the two locations where you can go to see usage statistics, basically.
Sure. On behalf of the ESPC community, thank you, Jasper, for taking the time today to complete this webinar. We really
No worries.
appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you for having me. And thanks everybody for listening in.
Great. Thank you, Jasper. Okay, everybody, this is the end of today's webinar. Thank you for joining us. As noted, recorded sessions will be available in the Resource Center, and you will be notified by email when they become available. A big thank you again to Jasper Oosterveld for his webinar today. Hopefully you can join us for the next webinar. Thank you, take care, and goodbye.